I start at the ending because that is where the noise stopped and the record began, with a retraction posted at noon, a donation receipt from the boy's parents to the VA clinic, and my name no longer glued to a lie. It looks clean now on paper, but the road to it ran through a parking lot where I was mocked under bright lights, a clip that turned me into a villain, and a house that went quiet when my wife chose optics over us. And I learned that patience, documents, and calm steps can move a mountain that anger cannot. I kept working my cases, logged every call, carried discs from a bar back room to a lawyer's table, watched a forensics map expose 6 cuts in a viral video, sat across from frightened parents in a fluorescent room, and signed a separation that hurt less than seeing my service years reduced to a meme. And I am telling this now not to chase sympathy, but to show how a man who spent a life preventing harm can protect his own name without throwing a punch. Because my dignity did not return with a shout. It returned with timestamps and forms and witnesses who remembered the shove that edits erased. And if my kitchen feels too big at night and the guest room stays made, I accept that as the cost of drawing a clear line, since respect is not a speech, it is a practice, and the practice begins here with what I did, what I refused to do, and how the truth, once gathered properly, made the loud part take care of itself. I learned later that the bar cameras caught everything in plain angles. But in the moment, I only had muscle memory and a simple plan. So I shifted Alice behind my right shoulder, kept my hands at chest height with open palms, and planted my feet so I could step back without tripping, because I understood the boys wanted a scene more than a fight, and a lens more than a bruise, and I refused to give them either. One circled with a hat pulled low and a phone held high. Another drifted wide to close our path to the truck, and a third performed for the others with loud offers toward my wife that made the crowd in the doorway snicker, and I felt the old heat crawl up my neck. But I forced it down with a slow breath, and a count I learned long ago. Then the stocky one bumped my shoulder hard enough to tilt me into the camera's frame while his friend laughed, and I rolled with it and stepped back again and said with my eyes and posture that I was leaving. And when the tall one faked a swing with his phone and clipped my ear, I caught his wrist without squeezing, released it at once, and guided Alice toward the lot while the doorway noise rose and fell like a wave. I kept my head straight and looked above the phones so I would not give them a stare they could crop and twist. And I spoke to Alice in the calm tone I use on job sites when someone thinks volume equals authority. And she nodded but kept stiff beside me. And for a second, I felt more alone with her at my elbow than I ever felt. On a tarmac halfway across the world, because I realized she was already measuring how this looked, not how it was. At the truck, I gave her the keys and scanned the lot for details I could write later, because details are a lifeline when lies start. To breathe. So I fixed in my mind the time on the tavern receipt, the 5 burnt bulbs along the eave, the way the doorway camera pointed slightly down and left, and the reflection line on the hood of a blue sedan that would later help the analyst. Map edits, and I read a partial plate on the car the boys leaned against. Then I let it go because obsession is not proof. I left the lot slow to avoid any claim that I sped at them, and I put my hazard lights on at the curb to let a couple cross, and the shortest one recorded me doing it as if he had trapped a rare animal. And I felt the kind of tired that sits in the bones rather than the head. But I did not let that tired choose my next move. At home, I wrote what I remembered in block, letters on a legal pad, and placed the receipt beside it, and I set a phone reminder to speak with Pete about his cameras first thing. And I put my watch on the counter and stood at the sink while the water ran and the hum of the dishwasher sounded, like a small engine clearing its throat, and I told myself the outcome would live or die by procedure, not feeling, which meant I had already done the 2 most important things a man can do when hunted by a story. I had refused the bait, and I had preserved the facts. And if the world wanted a villain, I would let them crave one without my help, while I gathered what would outlast their appetite. By morning, the clip found me before coffee and turned my steady hands into a threat, and my open palms into a frame for a lie. And I understood that replies would only feed it, so I closed the apps, set the phone face down, and chose the next best step, which was to collect originals before the crowd could decide the whole story by noon. I drove back to the bar at opening, thanked Pete for his patience, and followed him to the back where a small DVR blinked beside stacked boxes. And we watched. The raw angle that showed the shove, my step back, the open hands, the turn away, and the boys still shouting after I left the frame. And I asked him to copy it to 2 discs while he printed the system log and wrote the date and time, and he signed. The sleeves with a neat hand because he understood that memory means nothing without paper. And I left with the discs in a small envelope that felt heavier than it was because it carried my name inside it. On the walk to the truck, I saw the boys had already posted a second cut with captions that implied my wife refused me in public, and the comments filled with words that made age into a costume. And I reminded myself that a uniform once taught me to keep breathing when wind turned sharp. So I breathed and drove to my office and scanned the chain of custody forms into a folder with a clear title. And I wrote a short note to clients saying I would remain on schedule and that a formal statement would follow once platforms received preservation requests. At home that afternoon, Alice moved quietly through rooms and said she needed distance from any image of violence. And I heard a hospital memo in that sentence more than a marriage. And I let it sit without answer because I had a better task, which was to call a litigator I trusted. And when Maya returned the call, she spoke in calm steps about preserving links, serving notices, drafting a defamation complaint, and filing a PD report for harassment and simple assault based on the shove and the follow, and she told me to send every file and to keep a log of client calls and lost opportunities. And she promised a template letter I could send that listed report numbers without anger. And I felt my shoulders drop a notch, because process had entered the room. After dinner, I prepared the packet she asked for, including screenshots with visible timestamps, a photo of the disc sleeves, and a written summary in simple lines that avoided opinion. And while I uploaded the files, I watched Alice's phone light with a banner from Cole that mentioned a foundation meeting about my mess. And I did not touch her phone, and I did not ask for context, because a banner is not proof, but it is direction, and direction is enough for an early step. At night, the clip kept spinning through new accounts, yet I answered nobody, since silence in public made space for motion in private, and I laid out the next day like a small mission, starting with the PD intake, then a bank, walk-through for a client who still trusted me, then Maya's office to sign verifications, and I slept with my notes under a coaster on the nightstand so I would not reach for the feed when I woke. And I promised myself that the only story I would chase was the one that ends on paper. At the station, I sat in a clean chair under a buzzing light and gave a calm account that matched the discs, and the intake officer typed while I described the shove, the follow, the raised phone, the open hands, the step back, and the way I left the frame without returning. And I handed over one copy of the footage with a signed chain of custody page while the officer logged it with a number I wrote twice in my notebook so I would not trust memory later. And I added still images with time marks. That matched the bar's DVR log, and I asked for the incident to be screened for simple assault and harassment with a request for contact limits, and the officer nodded and said the supervisor would review. And I thanked her because manners still matter even when a room smells like old paper and sanitizer. Then I drove to my bank walkthrough and did my job with the same steady tone I used in the parking lot, because the best proof of who I am is the work I keep doing when noise rises. And I mapped blind corners, marked a broken latch, and gave the branch manager a short verbal plan without opinion. And when she asked about my safety, I said I was fine and that the facts were moving into place. And she relaxed enough to set our next date, which I wrote in ink before I left. After lunch, I met Maya, and we sat with the discs, the log, the screenshots, and my written summary, and she read without speaking until she finished and then outlined the steps that were already in motion, including preservation letters to platforms, a demand to the uploader to keep files untouched pending suit, and a draft complaint that would attach the affidavit from the bar owner once signed. And she told me to send a professional update to clients, with the report number, and she cautioned me to avoid any posts that could be twisted into heat, so I signed verifications and watched a paralegal bind the packet with a quiet skill that made me trust the building. At home, Alice said the hospital requested that she show distance from any hint of force and that she would follow their guidance, and I heard the words as a shield held toward a job rather than a husband, and I simply wrote them in my log with the same flat pen I used for everything else that day, because the record cares more about clarity than sting. And while we moved around each other in silence, her phone lit again with a preview from Cole about a foundation meeting in optics. And I looked away because proofs were already coming from better places than a banner. In the evening, a platform responded to Maya's letter and froze the clip pending review, and that small line of text felt like a door clicking toward the right side of the frame. And I organized my files in a box labeled with the date and the words bar lot incident. And I set my alarm for an early hour because the fundraiser gala sat on the next day's calendar. And I had decided to walk in calm clothes with quiet shoes and a plan that did not involve a raised voice, only papers that travel well under bright glass. And as I turned off the light, I thought about how many times I trained young men to act before pride wakes up. And I promised myself I would do the same when I faced the room. That had helped the edit grow. The fundraiser gala felt like a glass aquarium where everyone moved with slow smiles and quick eyes. So I entered with the same plan I use for site visits, which is to know the exits, keep the path clear, and carry my documents in a clean folder that can open without fluster. And I checked my coat, pinned my badge straight, and walked the floor once to map cameras, because large rooms tell on themselves if you listen. I saw Cole near a sponsor board with a group of younger staff, phone held chest, high like a badge he thought outranked paper. And I saw Alice at the far end beside a donor who liked long stories, and I felt the old instinct to walk toward her and close the gap. But I kept to the plan and stayed with procedure because proximity, without clarity, turns into theater. And I had not come for a scene. I had come for service. So I texted Maya that I was in place, then stood where sightlines were clean and waitstaff passed in regular loops, and I kept my face neutral while the hum of friendly talk wrapped around me. When Cole drifted closer, he spoke about unfortunate optics and suggested that my family should own the narrative before it ran away. And I told him calmly that I preferred to own originals rather than stories. And he smiled in a way people use when they want the room to think they are in charge. And that was the moment the process server appeared at his elbow like air made solid and addressed him by full name, and handed a packet that included preservation, letters, a demand for retraction, a draft complaint notice, and a clear request that all content be retained unaltered for forensic review. And I watched his expression flatten as he realized this was not a hallway rumor, but a paper event with file, numbers, and deadlines. Across the room, I saw Alice register the handoff, and I read a quick mix of alarm and calculation on her face, the kind of look people use when they weigh a job against a spouse. And I wrote that look in the margin of my mind, and did nothing with it, because my task did not include emotion tonight. My task included a timestamp from the event check-in, a witness list from volunteer badges, and a quiet photo of the sponsor wall that proved Cole stood within the foundation's official space when he received notice, and I gathered those without hurry. A donor asked if I was enjoying the evening, and I answered that the cause mattered and the venue was well organized. And I did not mention the paper in Cole's hand, or the way. His phone went dark for the first time that night, and I let the band play while I stepped into a corner to email a short update to Maya, who replied that next steps would include platform contact escalation and a draft motion for an injunction iffy. The clip stayed live, and I closed my phone and returned to the floor, where I kept my distance from Alice because every word between us in that room could be misread by ears that valued gossip over context. When I finally left, I signed the guest book for the clinic out of respect for the work they actually do. And I walked into the cold air with the steady sense that a line had moved from noise to record, and I drove home without turning on the radio, because the only sound I needed was the soft click of processes that had started to run. I drove home from the gala with the sense that paper had finally spoken louder than noise, and I set the folder on the kitchen table like a small anchor, then slept in short pieces because the house felt hollow. And at dawn, I brewed coffee and opened a clean document for clients, where I listed the police report number, the preservation notices, and the plan to stay on schedule without disruption. And I sent it before the sun cleared the hedges because steadiness early is better than apology late. Replies arrived through the morning in the plain tone busy people use when they choose trust. And I logged each note and attached it to the right file so nothing slipped. And while I worked, Alice moved through the hall with soft steps and said, The hospital expected distance from any image of force, and I wrote that sentence in my notebook without comment, because the record would carry it better than my voice. Then she took a pillow to the guest room and closed the door, and I cleaned the counter and placed the discs and logs in a plastic box labeled with date and incident so I would not hunt later. Near noon, the sergeant called to say a parent had sent screenshots of a private chat where one student bragged about bumping my shoulder for the camera, and she logged the images and forwarded a copy to my counsel, and I printed them and added them to the stack. Then walked into my workshop and swept the floor because order in a small room makes space for order in the larger mess, and after that, I opened our firm handbook to read the clause on public conduct and ethics, and I checked myself against it like a man checks a bolt before he steps on a ladder, and I wrote a short self-attestation to send with renewals so partners could see I took the clause seriously. The platform wrote in the afternoon to say the clip would stay hidden while a review team assessed our packet, and that line eased a knot I had carried under my ribs since the parking lot, and I used the calm to prepare a second round of notices to the uploader and to the fundraiser team that had boosted the post, with a request that any derivative edits remain untouched for forensics. And I sent them with certified tracking so a future judge would have more than my word. The house stayed quiet, and in the evening, Alice asked if I could slow the legal work for her sake, and I wrote that request down next to the hospital line, because I had learned that private pressure often arrives dressed as concern, and I needed a clear surface to see it. When the day ended, I stood at the sink and thought about respect as a practice rather than a speech, and I understood that my practice now was to keep documents safe, keep my schedule steady, avoid any comment that tasted like heat, and leave space for the truth to arrive in a form no caption can bend. And I slept with that plan like a map folded under my hand. The counselor's office sat between a bakery and a tailor, and the street smelled like bread and steam while I filled out a form that asked for reasons in small boxes, and I wrote that the reason was not anger but public harm that needed a record. And inside the room, a kind voice tried to name our trouble as stress and asked us to consider optics as if reputation were a fragile animal we both should feed, and I answered that reputation is built on what actually happened and on what you do next, not on the shape of a caption. And Alice said she felt overwhelmed and needed me to slow the legal work so her hospital would not tie her to a storm. And I kept my tone steady while I said I would not pause steps that kept the truth intact because once facts are lost, they do not return. And the counselor suggested a pause anyway and handed us breathing sheets. And I thanked her and left with a calm that felt cold but clean. Then drove straight to Maya's office where I signed a verified statement and reviewed a draft separation that protected the business, set mutual non-disparagement, and kept personal accounts from being used to wage a quiet war online, and I initialed each page and watched the paralegal mark them with bright tabs, so the packet would travel through the courthouse without drama. On the way home, I stopped at the notary to stamp a declaration of chain of custody for the discs, because even small edges help when the other side loves edits, and I emailed our accountant a clean ledger so no one could claim I hid funds while I pursued relief. And then I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a list of what I would and would not do until this ended. And high on the list, I wrote that I would answer no bait, would keep every appointment, would add every new piece of proof to the same box, would return each phone call with a short factual note, and would leave the guest room as it was because forcing closeness does not make respect return. In the evening, the sergeant called again to say the case had moved to a supervisor and that charges for simple assault and harassment were being prepared. And I wrote the case numbers twice and emailed them to Maya, who replied that a forensics report would land soon with a frame map showing where the shove was cut, and I imagined the report like a blueprint that would finally teach the casual viewers to see corners they missed. Then I put my phone face down and walked into the workshop and sanded a small board until the grain rose smooth, because the hands quiet the mind when paper has to do the loud part. And I ended the night by placing the separation draft beside my shadow box and telling myself that endings can be tidy even if they arrived by a hard road, and that I could meet tomorrow with order and let the process continue its slow, exact work. Thomas sent the report in a tidy packet that read like a clean verdict, and I sat at the kitchen table with a pen and marked the parts that mattered, including the file hash for the original bar footage, the timeline map that showed 6 cuts in the viral clip, the audio drift that removed the shove, and the reflection traces in a blue hood that proved a boy stepped into our path before the frame jump. I carried the packet to Maya and watched her build a motion for an injunction with exhibits, labeled in simple language so a judge would not need a translator to understand that context had been stripped for sport. And while her paralegal assembled tabs, I received an email from the platform that the post would remain hidden during review and that derivative uploads were also frozen, and that small administrative sentence felt more like justice than any roar could ever feel. The police followed through with charging papers for the stocky boy on simple assault and a harassment referral for the tall one, and I wrote the numbers in my log and made a second copy of the forensic summary for the file. And the calls from clients that day sounded almost cheerful in their normal tone, as if people wanted to show with steady work that a man's record lasts longer than a weekend. Late afternoon brought a message from a parent who asked for counsel contact to discuss resolution, and I forwarded it to Maya and returned to my tasks because my role was to keep the line straight and let the lawyers drive the car when it entered their road. That evening, Alice stood in the doorway and said the hospital preferred she show distance until things calmed, and I wrote the sentence and let it rest without fight because the record grows stronger when the quiet parts are written down without heat, and I slept on the couch by choice to give the house a simple map of boundaries. The next day, we met in a fluorescent room where chairs scraped linoleum and hand sanitizer sat like a sentinel, and the boys arrived with parents whose faces carried the weight that comes when private jokes hit public walls, and Maya laid out terms that aimed to repair rather than ruin, including full removal of the clip, a retraction video with language that admitted the edit misled viewers, a donation to the clinic where good work actually happens, and a promise to stay away from me and my business. And she said that if they complied, we would waive damages. And I watched relief move across the table, because mercy attached to clear rules feels like air to people who have been holding their breath. Cole's counsel tried to act like a bystander until Maya slid a draft subpoena list that included foundation names and PR contacts, and the sound in the room changed, and agreement moved from theory to ink, and I signed my parts and left with copies that smelled like toner and certainty. And on the sidewalk, the air felt ordinary again, which is the best feeling a man can ask for after a storm. The retraction posted at noon 2 days after the meeting, and it opened with a plain admission that the edit removed the shove and turned a step back into a threat. And the boys kept their eyes on the script while the camera stayed steady, and I watched it once, saved a copy, filed the platform confirmation with the same care I used for the first discs, and then closed the tab because I did not need to live in the comment section to know the wind had shifted. The clinic donation cleared that afternoon, and the receipt landed in Maya's inbox with a transaction number that I wrote on a sticky note and pressed to the top of the case box. And Cole's signed no contact agreement arrived with letterhead I recognized from gala programs, and I placed it beside the notarized affidavit from the bar owner and the forensics map, and the stack looked like a spine that could stand on its own without me pushing, which is the only kind of spine that matters after noise. My business renewals came, threw in normal envelopes that smelled like paper instead of smoke, and clients scheduled audits and asked for the same straight work I have always done. And I understood that trust returns in quiet steps, not with banners, and I returned its respect by showing up early and leaving notes that were clear and short. And in the evenings, I swept the workshop and set a small box aside for the things I wanted to carry forward, including the shadow box of ribbons, a brass coin from a friend who never asked for credit, and a copy of the injunction motion so I would never forget how fast a story can bend without a counterweight. At home, the guest room stayed made, and the house sounded like an empty station between trains. And Alice and I spoke through calendars and lists while the separation moved from draft to file to stamp, and we signed a mutual non-disparagement so neither of us could turn grief into fuel for strangers. And we divided accounts with the care you use when handling glass, and we set a date for keys and garage codes so there would be no late confusion. And I placed a final copy of the agreement in the box with the other papers because endings deserve order. The platform later sent completion confirmations for takedowns of mirrors and clips, and I filed them in the same folder and felt a small weight leave the space behind my ribs. And the officer emailed that the boys had complied with terms and completed an apology that would stay on record if they applied for internships. And I wrote that down, not out of spite, but because accountability without a path forward turns young people into statues. and statues teach nothing. Frank invited me to speak to his apprentices about composure during small humiliations that feel large, and I stood in a break room beside a rack of hard hats and told them in plain terms that a man protects his name by protecting evidence first, breath second, and pride never. And I watched their shoulders loosen the way. My own had loosened when a platform wrote that a clip was hidden for review, and I drove home with a sense that my duty was not to fight again, but to teach this quiet method to anyone who might need it. That night, I moved the shadow box from the hallway to my office and set it above the case box like a guide, not a warning. And I looked around a room that had become simple again, and I understood that this was not victory, but dignity. And dignity was enough. And I turned off the light, without checking a single feed because the only story left to manage was the one on my desk. And paper does not need applause to do its job. I closed out the last confirmations from the platforms and filed them beside the injunction motion, then drove to the tavern with a thank you envelope for Pete because people who keep clean cameras help more than they know, and I told him in steady words that his chain of custody habit protected more than a business. It protected a name, and I left a note offering to cover a camera upgrade because the best lessons deserve tools, and on the way back I stopped by the station to sign a property receipt so the disk I had surrendered would move through evidence without question, and the sergeant said the case would record compliance and stay available for internship background checks if anyone asked. And I wrote that phrasing into the log, because phrasing matters when months pass and memories smooth edges. At the office, I drafted a short policy for my staff called Parking Lot Protocol, with 4 steps that fit on a single card: de-escalate, disengage, document, deliver, and I laminated the cards and handed them out at our Monday huddle while I explained that pride is a spark and paper is water. And I watched the younger analysts breathe out because rules give people a handhold when humiliation feels close. And I added a quiet line to our client contracts about media incidents so no one would wonder how we respond next time a cut tries to stand in for truth. That afternoon, I met Alice at the kitchen table for keys and codes, and we spoke in the plain tone of 2 people who had once shared louder words and had now chosen order, and I placed my copies of the separation and non-disparagement inside a clear sleeve and slid a second set for her to keep. And I took a box marked albums to the garage because history can remain intact even when a direction changes, and I did not ask about Cole or posts or optics because that story belongs to someone else now. Mine is finished on paper. The week after, Frank's apprentices stood in a circle around a folding table while I laid out the bar scene in simple beats and showed them how a calm step saved me more than any strike would have. And I told them that lawful tools look slow until they move, and then they move like a door on the right hinge. And they nodded the way young workers nod when a thing finally makes sense in the body. Contracts renewed, new work arrived, and I scheduled a hospital audit for a different client with the same care I give to every floor where alarms blink and people work hard, because I refuse to let the noise make me small. And I wrote a 1-page reflection for my own file that listed the habits that carried me: early notice, quiet counsel, visible honesty with clients, and firm boundaries at home. And I added a last line that reminded me to keep my voice level even when the room chooses heat. One evening, I returned to Murphy's, ordered a soda, and stood for a minute under the parking lot lights that had once felt like a trial. And I saw only paint on asphalt and a lens pointed at a door. And I understood that the scene had never owned me. I had owned my steps inside it. And I walked back to the truck with the easy gait that returns when a name is steady again. And I drove home to the office where the shadow box sits above a labeled case box, and I felt no triumph, only the plain dignity of work done right, which is enough for a man who plans to keep breathing slow, keep his hands open, and let the loud part stay on paper where it belongs. I kept my routine tight because routine keeps a man honest, so I woke early, stretched the old shoulder that still remembered the bump, and wrote 3 lines in a small book about what mattered that day. Then I reviewed the policy cards I'd printed for the staff and mailed a set to a friend who ran a venue with poor lighting, since good tools travel better than speeches. And after that, I drove to a site visit where a new manager wanted a calm audit instead of theater, and I walked his halls with quiet steps, checked camera angles, tested locks, and left notes that were clear and short because clear and short survive screenshots. And while I worked, he asked softly about the clip, and I answered in the same soft tone that the matter sat on. Paper and had been resolved with process, and I saw his shoulders ease because he had been told to fear a rumor more than a record. Later, I stopped by the clinic that received the donation and shook hands with a nurse who remembered years when we all were younger and tired, and I thought about how a single weekend almost bent 30 years of steady work, and I felt grateful for the people who still choose facts when noise is loud, and I wrote a message to the boys through their counsel that said, I wish them well and hope the lesson stayed with them when someone pushed a phone into their hands. And I sent it because closure should include a path forward, not just a wall. The house changed shape once the keys moved and the garage clicked. Different. And I kept a corner of the workshop for memory but left the rest clean for whatever was next. Not as a symbol, but as a place where hands can still make order. And I learned to cook a simple meal for one without turning the kitchen into a stage for sadness. And I walked at dusk along a loop where streetlights come on in a slow wave. And I let the quiet show me that life does not end when a story ends. It shifts to a new lane with the same engine humming. A young analyst called one night about a lobby argument that was turning red on the cameras, and I coached him to count a breath, step back, say he was leaving, and write it down later with time and place. And the call reminded me that my job now includes passing along a habit, not just guarding a door, and I wrote a short guide called Calm Steps Under Bright Lights and posted it on our internal page, and the team shared it more than any big case study we had ever written, which told me that people are hungry for simple maps when pride tempts them to sprint. I received a quiet invite from a trade group to speak about evidence and restraint, and I accepted because useful words belong in rooms where decisions get made. And I ended that day by placing a new folder in the cabinet labeled Teaching and Outreach, because the best revenge against a bad edit is a generation that knows how to see. And I stood in the doorway of my office and looked at the shadow box above the case box and felt the same even measure in my chest that I feel when a door is locked, a camera is aligned, and a plan is printed. Which is to say, I felt safe again in my own name, and that safety arrived without a shout, only with steady steps that I can now repeat whenever the lights flare and someone tries to turn a man into a story. The trade talk came on a gray morning in a quiet hotel room where I ironed a shirt and repeated my rules in my head. De-escalate, disengage, document, deliver. And when I stood at the podium, I kept my voice even and my notes short. Because simple. Lines carry farther than hot speeches. And afterward, a manager with tired eyes thanked me with a steady handshake that said the message had landed. On the drive home, I took the long route past the tavern and the clinic and the courthouse and felt a clean line connect them. Because that line was the path a man can walk when pride shouts and truth whispers. And I promised myself to keep walking it until it felt like second nature for everyone I teach. At dusk, I returned to the loop where the streetlights blink on, and I thought about the boys, the server room, the settlement table, the quiet goodbye at the kitchen counter, and the way dignity does not crash in. It arrives like breathing, slow and regular, until the noise fades and the name remains. And I went to sleep with the box of papers under the shadow box, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that calm steps under bright lights are enough. I woke early and checked the cabinet where the case box sits under the shadow box, because that order keeps the mind steady when days start to sprawl. Then I sketched a small workshop project and set the plane on fresh wood, and the sound of shavings felt like a clean page turning. And when the email pinged, I saw a new contract from a hospital that wanted a calmer audit process across their campuses, which told me the lesson had traveled beyond my circle. I drove out to walk their floors with a young coordinator who watched my hands as much as my notes, and I explained in simple steps how we keep dignity intact when tempers rise. And he nodded the way people do when they finally see a map where there was fog. Later, I returned the thank you envelope from Pete with a receipt for the camera upgrade, because gratitude is a habit like any other, and habits make a life. Near dusk, I stood under the same parking lot lights and felt no tremor, only the plain weight of steady steps that outlast. Edits, and I went home to close the drawer with the new folder labeled Teaching because the work continues and the name holds. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city are you watching, 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 watching.